And I believe Dashun and James are around. Yes, I see Dashun. Excellent. So let me pin. And I'm going to be acting as a moderator. I didn't share any question, so this is going to be completely improvised, not by me, by the panelists. But so so I guess we have until 12, like 50 minutes, and I'll just ask a couple of questions just to get everybody going, and I hope these questions can spur some discussion. So the first question I would like to ask is, all of you talk about diversity from different points of view, but I was curious to hear about how you think biases and problems that we have found in data sets might affect some of the, I guess there are two questions. So there are biases in the data sometimes, or in practices on sciences in the past, maybe related to gender, race, but also like prestige of certain institutions. How do you think that affects your findings? And second part of that question is perhaps how you think, are you thinking about diversity in those dimensions too? When you mentioned James about diversity, and maybe Dashun, when he's thinking about exploration, is he thinking about those dimensions too? And then also Ying, when she thinks about diversity and that in those dimensions, she explicitly mentioned those. So let's start with James.
So yeah, absolutely. One of the biases in the data, and by biases I don't mean anything bad, I just mean that the data for the functions and things that we were measuring, that it could kind of create biased results. So for example, if I'm talking about the diversity in the teams, right? I mean, like socially disconnected teams, and that is going to be a function of the disambiguation of the authors. So for example, if I'm looking at foreign names, German names with non-Latin characters in them, for example, right? Or, Cyrillic or other names that have, that are basically transliterated into Latin characters, then what you'll see is across publications, they're more likely to be spelled differently. And so I'm more likely to create smaller clusters of those authors that are smaller than the authors themselves. And that means there's going to appear to be more disconnection in those spaces than there is in spaces where the authors have standard names, and especially in countries like Korea, for example, where there's much more just like nation level standardization. And so there it'll appear like more people are the same person. You'll have kind of a homonym context versus, Russian scientists, German scientists, where it'll appear that the same person is multiple different people. And that does have an effect. So it does appear falsely that people from those places are more or less clustered. And so anytime you're doing identification, the same is true for like methodological diversity. When you assume that two methods are the same method, or that the same method is two separate methods, then in the context of analyzing diversity in the way that we analyze it, your measurements will be very sensitive to those cutoffs. And so the way in which I treat that problem is to create an upper and lower bound, and to show that the findings or the inferences that I'm making from the data are insensitive to those upper and lower bounds of basically kind of like clustering identification of the same authors, the same methods, and the same citations. But I think that's something that, anytime you're looking at a dependency-based data structure, disambiguation ends up massively influencing the likelihood that you're going to see, connection or disconnection in your data. And so I think you have to be very sensitive to that. So, and of course, that's going to influence also the likelihood of gender identification, for example, across the, we have agglomerative names, the same last names, then you also have less signal in the first name of the likelihood that someone's male or female or other, kind of like sub country ethnicity. So again, I think, there are many things that one can do, but I think the strongest epistemological thing to do is basically show the most and least conservative estimate, and then show that your findings are insensitive to those more and less conservative bounds.
Oh, what about you, Dashun?
I agree. No, so I think one example, if you think about the author name disambiguation, I think, it's a question of diversity of productivity. One common question, when we're studying careers, a common question is, these are, by definition, there's a selection bias, right? We're studying people who have long enough careers, where in reality, we know for a lot of people, maybe publish on paper and then they left science, or a lot of people have, like, there's very quick drop off in the career stage. So in that sense, I think, we should also be thinking about the potential selection bias for any of the results that we may be finding, and realizing this only operates on the set of data sets that we do have, we do analyze, right? So, but then at the same time, I also find just thinking about selection bias in terms of all these studies using author name disambiguation also misses an important point. And that important point is to think about, if you look, like, people study careers for 100 years already, right? If you look at all the studies from Harriet Zuckerman, all the other studies, like, the psychologists study it, economists study it. Before this wave of studying, most recent wave of studying careers, I would argue all the previous waves were primarily focused on selected very few geniuses of the geniuses, because that was before the name disambiguation algorithm came about. Before that, how do you study? Then you have to hand collect their biographies and assemble the data, very painfully assemble all these data sets. And while these data are high quality, and because you're limited by the computational power, so imagine you can only hire RAs to assemble 100 careers. Then what do you select? You don't do random 100 people, right? You go to, the most important 100 people. So that has been sort of traditionally how we think about careers. So in some ways, I think it's the discussions of author disambiguation I want to emphasize, while we have to understand that necessarily induces a selection bias, because author disambiguation only works if you have a lot of records for an individual. But at the same time, only emphasizing on the selection issue also misses a bigger picture, namely the new data sets we're analyzing actually is fixing some of the diversity issues, while it's necessarily still imperfect, and there's so much progress needs to be made, but it's actually fixing in my mind, a bigger problem. Imagine we're really look at the tip of the iceberg. Now, at least maybe we're looking at just the tip of the iceberg. Now we gotta look at, underneath what's going on, but we should also recognize the progress in these issues. Okay.
Can I throw in just one thing that kind of
Completely agree.
that, and suggest it just is on that specific topic. I'm excited to hear Ying's response as well. I'm just going to share my screen briefly on this. Is a finding that is unpublished. So here's data where we basically look in at specific grants from the Umetrics data set. So this is complete HR records associated with particular grants that are coming in. And one of the things that you see, so this is all the different people that are paid for by grants. So obviously it's, faculty and others, but it's also like a ton of administrative staff, researchers, and all this stuff. And one of the things that you find is that, so on the bottom, we've got the fraction that are imputed male on the x-axis, and we've got the sites or credits per year. So the likelihood that for the same amount of work that a man versus a woman ends up getting credited with a publication, right? So I put in 5 hours, you put in 5 hours, hour for hour, how much, what's the likelihood that that I get cited on this piece? And what you see is heteroskedasticity with respect to the fraction imputed male, right? So if you basically have like an administrator role, so this is like digging deeper into that like undersea iceberg, basically an RA, a research assistant or administrator on the grant, if they're male, they're much more likely to be credited with being an author on the piece than if they're female, hour for hour, contributing the same amount. And that expands as the role has a predominance of men that are imputed to that role as a whole, as a kind of as a global estimate. So this basically suggests that, like it's an extreme version of Dashun's like, okay, we're going from like the big hits to like all the scientists credited on the paper. And if we dig down deeper into who contributed to the actual science in the paper, it's much less likely that that women are credited and that female predominant roles are credited. So I think that we should be basically digging deep to figure out how deep our systematic bias is. In this case, it's a highly systematic bias that's kind of hidden. And as you can see, it's actually quite small for faculty and postgrad and grad student researchers. It's very high for these other extremely undercredited roles. Anyway, that's all I'll say.
This is a question for Bruce on Thursday on his U-Metrics project. So Ying, how do you think about this issue?
Yeah, so I want to talk about two perspectives. I think also diverse in data set actually generate the disparity, because I think group are well funded actually can access diverse data set, or they have money to hire students to crawl the web, or donate through the corporate relationship. The corporate will don't give you a lot of preparatory data that you can actually analyze. While team are less funded, they actually has less diverse data access privilege, because a very sad story for us as our community is the worst story, the worst news I heard, we all facing is Microsoft academic graph is not going to be funded. So, so the whole team was basically not fired, but actually dissolved from Microsoft. And because the reason is academic graph only using a publication, but not many visit page view on the actually your profile. Then the question is, what is next for group with less funded and without the Microsoft academic graph, what we can do? I think is that any like I know Dashun and James, you have the institution, you have this 5-year funding for team science conference. Is there any bottom up community effort that we can actually share data in certain way that we can generate the diverse in data set sharing and build a repository that all kinds of different data in science of science people actually are using and which can share in certain way, or even or de-identified whatsoever to exclude all this proprietary information, that we can actually have diverse data set. We can take a look, and I'm sure this is extremely important for the community as well. Second, for the diversity, I think diversity is very further divided. It's there's no like a limit. You say 0.6 is diverse, now 0.7, 0.5 is not diverse. How do you measure the diverse? Like, oh, these people from two different institutes, therefore they're diverse. Actually, they might be very non-diverse, because they know each other, they come from the same mentor, they do the same thing, they go to the same conference. They're more similar than actually two person from the same institution. Like, institution is huge, right? Even from iSchool, right? We have people working on the healthcare, and we have people working on the design. They're very different. But if we measure diversity from affiliation, we treat them as it's a lower diversity. So this kind of nuances, how we do, and especially, I feel like large scale data science is good. Science of science is great, but what we found is all general rules, which is hard to implement in the real life. And team science, the community, they go through the observation, they look at individual group, they found very concrete kind of rules of actually like how to build a trust, how do you let people speak out. Those are very human rules that people can follow, But the problem, they couldn't generalize in more different like group. I was thinking about how we can like push them together. So I'm like, from my research, I'm doing like team power. I look at the collaborator who actually doing the team observation. So if I can find a pattern that from the large science, and they can use the pattern generate hypothesis for this team observer, they can actually go to the team to observe, is this pattern really happened in real individual team, and can get more nuances. I think the combined together will be more powerful and practical for our field.
Cool. So, I want to ask a question now about I want to understand how you see where we're going with this science enterprise. So
can I respond to Ying's earlier comments on data? Or James, do you have looks like you also wanted to say something.
No, I was actually wondering, I know that you have some insights about the future of Microsoft Academic Graph, so I thought it'd be great if you could share.
Okay, so I had a long phone call with Quan Sang, who is a close friend and collaborator. He is the founder of MAG Data. So let me talk about that, and then also talk about some other efforts that will be useful for the community. So MAG is sunsetting by the end of the year. It's a disappointing news, but it's not completely unexpected. The whole team is fine, just so in case you're wondering, they're transitioning into another unit that will be more closely aligned with Microsoft business functions. So, so they're fine. But then, I think this incident, on one hand highlights the fragility of science, because I think on one hand highlights, what if Google Scholar disappears tomorrow? Then what happens to science? So so that's the broader, I'm not gonna get into that. One thing I do wanna emphasize is MAG Data will be fine, looks like. So there is a group that has decided to take it up and transition. So it's outside of Microsoft, it's community organized, it's open source, that's going to take over the data. And that group just got a $5 million grant to do that. So it's well funded. It looks like, it's happening. I'm grateful for that effort. From Microsoft, it seems like there's a broad view of will of collaborating and making sure there's a continuity in the data. But but on the other hand, there will be some transitioning, but just so we know, it's not completely disappearing. But it is a very important resource for sure in thinking about the core data sets we use as a community. So we'll have a version by the end of the year, like December, we'll have a snapshot, and then then there will be some transition time. And another thing that I want to highlight is sort of following what Ying mentioned. So I do want to sort of emphasize to let everybody know there has been a extensive effort within my team, specifically collaborating with a few other groups. So we're nucleating, and hopefully we'll be able to announce soon, is to create a data lake for the field. And so, and this will be like twofold of efforts. One is to making sure everybody is operating on the latest data, best the latest data possible, because I feel like I don't want to see papers say, I analyzed this one journal in Eastern Europe of 2 years and then I found something. And I just feel like that shouldn't be the state of the field. And I think by providing a freely available, well-cleaned all the data that's free can be made freely available. I think it will be easy for everybody to just download and use, and hopefully will generate more research and get more people into this kind of research. Second is hopefully that will be easier for reviewer to say, you really don't have excuse to not using the the best data sets right now, and you should make sure your results are replicable. And I think the second goal of this is also, I think, to make it more scalable, our efforts as a community, because I have like 47 participants on this call. Probably 45 of them implemented Brian Woodsy's novelty conventionality measure painfully using 2 months of debugging time. And I just, or like, Lin Fei and Jason Owen Smith, Russell Funk's disruption measure, for example. I think having a data set like that basically would allow us to compute all this measure already. And then everybody can just use this measure. And so if you publish a paper, so we're trying to work out a interface where if you publish a paper and having a new metric or something measure that's useful and that's becoming sort of community accepted, we're also welcome you to contribute. And so you can send me a column and then we can put it onto the data, push it to the data. And so the hope is, this will be a way for us to really economize all these efforts and to really sort of take advantage of the so much data that are available. Yeah.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, so there is some links about the project that our research, but now that Shun is mentioned, these other projects sounds awesome too. So I wanted to before, I'm going to open the floor for questions from the audience, but I wanted to maybe see what you think about the future of science of science. And I wanted to see like broadly where you think we are going. I mean, so far there are just so many disciplines and so many departments, and I feel like everybody that is working in science of science, at least in the past, has been like doing stuff on the side. It's not really like part of a department. There's not like one major field that has or discipline that has taken on this to study it. So we have computer scientists, physicists, sociologists, information scientists, librarians. So I wanted to for you to let us know what your thoughts are about the futures of science. Like it could be all the way from like, are we going to have like a PhD in science of science, or are we going to have a certificate? Do you think we are going to go more into maybe taking these insights and transforming them into policy applications? What do you think that is what the future, maybe 5 years, 10 years from now, look like for science of science?
Okay.
Let's start with James.
So, it's interesting because I hope in some ways for greater institutions and autonomy and whatever, and for less, for the reason that I'll mention. So one, I think, as Da-Shun mentioned, we want people to have, the latest data sets. We want, people to have, pre-computed measures. We want a cumulative science. We want to be able to build on prior discoveries rather than just like every new paper is like a new implementation or a slightly different measure. I've got a paper coming out of novelty measures that just show that, like a bunch of novelty measures, which are, have been published or negatively correlated with one another. I mean, you can find basically anything that you want if you search across the novelty metric space. I mean, it's ridiculous. So I think absolutely the kinds of institutions that build a cumulative science and field level knowledge are absolutely critical. On the other hand, I'm afraid of too much institutionalization and autonomy because the power of the science of science is to transform the specific sciences. It's to transform ecology and evolution. It's to transform physics. It's to transform, sociology and economics and psychology and all these different particular fields. And so I think for that to be correct, because of the historical institutions of peer review and the way in which grant funding is allocated, in which experts within these fields are systematically recruited to run and drive advance and allocations and promotion and all these kinds of things. I think we need the best physics to take into account science of science principles, for example, about diversity and about non-overlap and independence and about all these different factors. And so I think that's going to take what at the end of Daxun's Science of Science book calls, all the science of science. We're going to need all the imaginary and imagination and measures and metrics from all the fields. If we're interested in diversity, then ecology and evolution has been thinking about biodiversity for longer, in formal ways for longer than anybody else. Like we need to be current with their imagination, and we need them to have bought in to the scientific validity of these principles with respect to their science. So I think this is not like, how do we become a profession? Well, we need training institutions and we need like shared data. I think my hope is that it goes both ways, and it's going to require enormous effort to both institutionalize, to create better and more specific and more general data and measures on the one hand, and simultaneously on the other, to have champions within these fields who are bona fide, really high profile physicists and ecologists and sociologists and economists and others, taking into account these principles in their specific research, both for the purposes of discovery and validation and meta-analysis and all these things. So I think I can't think of another scientific case that's really like this, other than maybe statistics, the history of statistics, where it's its own field, and yet it's like its advance and power really comes in the context of individual fields identifying distributions as being relevant to their distribution of data, and really kind of like building up these principles as relevant to their epistemic process. So anyway, that's my take, and that's going to take some novel institutional effort to do that.
So can I add something?
Yeah, that should please.
So Ying, feel free if you want to jump in.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I want to follow up on one point. I'll make one additional point. The last James mentioned the last chapter of the book is calling for all the science of science, and there's one short page, and that's actually joint developed between me and James. In fact, so I should acknowledge this. James is very instrumental in shaping the view in that. And I want to sort of think through that and sort of illustrate, because this wasn't an intuitive concept for me, but I think it's been helpful for me to think about what is the science of science. I do agree that we should think about what kind of institution will make sense for the field, but this is also a very unique field. So we should also be creative. I'm optimistic we will figure out the right institution. Like even if you think about traditional department, like I see a very good comments in the chat is, a department will actually meet the diversity in the traditional sense. So I don't think we have a right answer yet, to be honest. At least I don't have I've been thinking about a lot about this lately. I don't think we have the right answer exactly. Okay, that for sure is the way to go with the institution building. But I'm optimistic over the next 3 years also, we will have a much better idea of what this is. But I think following on all the science of science thoughts, I think this is, to me, very important to think about the contribution of science. Just like when I was writing the book, I basically wrote 2 versions of the book, where the first version you guys didn't see. I had the first draft and then I deleted everything, because the first version was written for people who do science of science. So, I created all this and sort of get all the research, like a gigantic review paper, okay? And then I realized, why do I need that? Because, James already know the research, Ying would already buy the book, why do I have to write the book for them? So I deleted all that and then started the second version of the book, which sort of morphed into the first version, which is to think about, well, what's the value of science of science? Is that all the insights are useful for every scientist. Just like every scientist, when you start doing science, you need to read Thomas Kuhn, so that you know what is a new idea, what's groundbreaking idea, how to think about how science progress. And the way we think about science of science is to also think about, it's not just thinking about, oh, we're the experts on how to use H-index, what are pitfalls for a matrix. Sure, that is one contribution, but the broader contribution in the field is to generate insights that help every scientist better think about how science works. Just like every business would have a CIO office, and can you imagine today, like a business doesn't have, like a big business doesn't have a CIO office, and today's science in United States is 2.6% of GDP. In South Korea, it's like about 5%. For such a big sector, can you imagine we don't have a CIO office? So to me, that's an important change of mindset. And I think it's safe to say some people in our thought leaders in the field may not even share that mindset. For example, I would imagine there are people like my first version of the book much better than my current version. But I think as a field, we have to think very broad in terms of what we can contribute. So that's kind of a long point on the first point I want to mention. And I do want to sort of think about a second point, which is recently what I've been thinking a lot in organizing the conference. The conference James mentioned in DC is right now general co-chair is me, James Evans, as well as Heidi Williams, a top economist in Stanford. And I think in thinking through this, I think growingly, it makes me think about not just science of science, but science of science and innovation. So I think that is a point to me is growing, like to me speak more and more in terms of the core contribution of the field. And I do want to think about I encourage everybody to think about not just science of science, but science and innovation. Because in the end, we have to say why it matters. Okay, the first order degree matters is that it helps all the scientists, help science decision makers. But then the real opportunity to show it matters is for growth, is for prosperity. And that's where innovation comes in. Science is the engine that enables innovation. Innovation is the engine that enables economic growth, improve well-being and standards living. And innovation is the answer for the next 100 years. How do we improve standards of living and well-being of the society? An answer comes from innovation. So that's, to me, is where it's most exciting for the field, is for us to broaden the mindset and think about how everything we study is helping, although indirectly right now, in improving the economic progress, the standards of living across the world. So to me, that's a very important point. So just sort of the 2 points I want to illustrate.
Okay, I want to throw a totally different thing. I think science of science should be blamed for our constant fatigue and burnout and the chasing games. Like, I think research should be enjoyable journey that we enjoy. We go swim and talk. Look at Daniel and Amos. They go to the garden, they talk. They don't publish 10 papers a year. They publish a few, but very high. This is science of science generates statistics and influence policy that's driven by, either H-index or statistic impact. I think it's like everybody is chasing this impact, and even undergraduate students have to join this publication course to produce papers just to be able to get to the better college. And I think the whole thing is sick. Like, I want, have a summer free. I won't have a day that I say, wow, I feel like I have nothing to do. I feel boring. I like to be bored, but currently I have so much things to do. I constantly, like, the to-do list is way more than what I can manage now. I think this may exist in every scientist's life now. So is we have a science of science community that we can generate the better statistics or something can actually influence the policy that slow down these whole things and let people being creative, right? Not measure you by your number, like your tenure evaluation, how many paper, what is impact, and can we do something like really like that, go to this literature, find the gene or drug and really facilitate science discovery rather than the measure everybody has the HINDEX or Google Scholar hat on it. And that doesn't mean things. I see so many great talent scholars. They have a very little Google Scholar number there. And and people already dead. They're dead for 10 years. Their Google Scholar is increasing. Like every year, 10,000 times, like citation every year increasing. And this 1 year increasing is equal to a person's whole career life. There can accumulate citation numbers. I think these are the things I want to throw to our community. Can we make research a enjoyable journey? And we look at all these great discovery in earliest time, where is enjoyable. There's no any measure was there, and they actually produce a lot of great things. So it's and also the mental health. My students feel like how many conference submissions they have to submit, and they were constantly rejected. And if they don't have this paper, they could not get a job in the dream industry that they have. This is become like a money kind of treating kind of things. Science should not be treated as money, as a value or treat like in treating. I think we as a community, we can influence these policymakers. We can look at research and look at paper to think about something different. This is one thing. Second, I want to talk about the teaming, because I think science of science, like teaming is the $1 billion questions, because no matter you are in science, you are in your nonprofit, you are in company, whatever you want to do, individual person hardly to do it, right? Has to combine with another one. So teaming is how you team people together. It's will decide whether your startup will survive or die. And teaming is extremely important. And we as a domain, we actually as a community, we can actually contribute. I cannot say we solve all of this, but we definitely can contribute the teaming problem. Should we put all these people with high age difference or coming from different prestige universities, right? Research tier, different tier university, or company, and all these teams, how they perform, what is the best like combination and some statistical recommendation of teaming that I think this can contribute a lot. And furthermore, we should also invite it, like for James and Dashan, your conference. Maybe you invite the people from business school, from people really do qualitative interview and observation, and they look at the team and their team, how they are teaming and how they generate output, how they measure their things might be very, beneficial to our community. I think combine those together, I think that's the road we need to go. And hopefully we can generate some insightful or useful, policies that can make our research life more enjoyable.
Thank you. After that powerful speech, we have an opportunity to make science of science perhaps more balanced. So I'll open the floor for questions. If there are questions from the audience, I see Mengyi with a question. I don't know if that's from before or you wanted to ask something to the panel.
Yeah, I have a specific question for Dashan. So we know that Michael Jordan have 2 horse race. And we also know that the first horse race and the second horse race is actually 2 different Michael Jordans. They adjust their career according to their states. And I was wondering, because in your study, you found that most people only have one, rarely have two. Did you find any difference between people that have early horse rate versus late horse rate? And did you think by comparing them, you can extract features in the future that enable people to have multiple horse rate or even a whole horse rate along the career? I think in the sport teams, this is becoming, in NBA, you'll see LeBron James probably have the single horse rate throughout the career. I was thinking, if you can get insights from your research to make a scientist.
All right, just clarify which Michael Jordan we're talking about. Is this the Bulls Michael Jordan or Berkeley Michael Jordan? Which one we're talking
I think
about?
NBA is Michael Jordan.
Oh, okay. So the sports Michael Jordan. Okay.
Yeah, so he has two horse race.
This the other Michael Jordan is in my data set. So
I was thinking the same thing,
Confusing,
you know,
confusing, yeah.
this probably.
That's a disambiguation problem.
Right.
Well, there are different middle names, so this can be sorted out. Anyway, so you know, I should clarify the idea of house streak started 1980s in psychology, and since then it has been heavily discussed and debated across sports, financial markets, and gambling. Right, so these are all sort of very relevant concepts of house streaks, and the patterns we observe. Well, it's actually still debating after 30-something years whether there's a house streak or not in these domains, primarily because of the small number issue in statistics. So what we're studying is basically try to think about this concept in careers. Especially creative careers. And I think later on after the original paper, other people have shown this is extended to show business, extended to music, for example, different other careers. But you know, it will follow a fundamentally different mechanism for sports, or the Michael Jordan in basketball will have different mechanism or house streak than the Michael Jordan from Berkeley AI. So this, I don't think we have evidence that will speak that they share the same way. In science, if you think about a question of people have two house streaks, what we do have evidence for is this idea of exploration followed by exploitation. It's true for the first house streak, and then it's also true when you have the second house streak. So this pattern does seem to repeat itself when you think about exploration followed by exploitation. But yeah, so that's kind of what we do know so far. Question. And if we look at statistically, if your first house streak is hotter than the second, we don't have that evidence. It looks like they're equally hot. So it is like, it's not clear. Like it's not like your early, for people who do have two, which by the way, is fewer people have two, but you know, about 20-something% of people have two. So when you look at the two, they are also quite statistically indistinguishable within person. Yeah.
Cool. We have a question from Robert Ward.
Hey everyone. Sorry, I got tape over my. So I wanted to follow on some of the comments that James and the other panelists made about institution and policy design for sort of the long run in science. And it seems to me that there's this sort of tension between the benefits that you often realize from bridging across fields, and also these worries about consilience or eroding those boundaries being harmful in the long run for scientific progress. And it seems like it's very difficult to find where that, if it's a tipping point or where that trade-off starts to turn negative, and how you actually design a policy that maintains the benefits of bridging without getting those negative side effects in the long run. So I'm just curious about what you guys think.
Just I'll throw it.
I don't think I follow, so why don't you go, James? I don't think I follow.
Yeah, I think, well, it was, I mean, so in my talk earlier, just for Ying and Dashun, I talked about how it is that you find benefits to to bridging. Although if you basically threw all of your resources into bridging, then there'd be effectively no more bridging. Right. So if there are great benefits to bridging between fields, one of the things that we can show is if you have that there's a stable kind of attention space. And so if all fields are talking to one another all the time, then there are fewer things that they're talking about. And so you have less things that are basically being expertly discussed across the scientific space. And so, so how do you basically sustain diversity across these fields by allowing them to focus different fields to focus on different places? And I think part of it is just that it's easy to basically say in a way that ignores causality that we've seen that important work has come from interdisciplinarity in the past, and so let's just throw all of our resources into interdisciplinarity in the future. And I would say that was kind of like World War II's policy relevant innovation investment. They basically were like, okay, we want you to exploit every firm piece of information that we know, and we want to just harvest weapons level offensive and defensive insights relevant to that thing. And I think that if we care about the long term sustainable diversity, then we will continue to grow fields of focused expertise. And the challenge, of course, is how do we find ways to evolve those institutions over time? So, for example, if you look at the NSF and their funding organization, it has very slowly adapted. But for 60 years, for example, the Organization of Chemistry into organic and inorganic, and a complete ignorance of the relationship between kind of like the biological sciences and organic and inorganic chemistry was institutionalized into that system. So there was no evolution. And then there was a kind of a punctuated jump. So I think finding ways to institutionally review field level boundaries to kind of facilitate fields, but facilitate intelligent fields, right? Intelligent field boundaries. So basically to kind of like update our institutions to reflect those boundaries. I think that's a contribution that the science of science could make, which would both improve basically scientific field level expertise, and it would improve the arbitraging of that expertise in multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary work. And I think one question, I think this is a much broader policy related issue, is about failure. And this relates to Ying Ding's comments earlier about, hey, students, it's like, they're like trying to publish all this stuff and all of it's getting rejected. I think, I actually don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. And I think that, I think we have to, I think we want more failure in general. If we care about long-term discovery, then I think we have to, I think we have to, this is a public discussion. That means we have to engage in a lot of things that are very unlikely. And I think it moves, it pushes, if we care about that, it pushes science more towards this. So it looks in some ways like finance, right? You've got folks in finance that are bringing in microwave data and all kinds of things to see their association to global markets. They're very low likelihood associations that could improve their predictions. And I think exploring beyond the boundaries of field level common sense and expertise would generate necessarily more failures. But at the same time, it increases the kind of our global capacity to generate insight that basically breaks theoretical bounds. So my personal preference for basically, like peacetime sustainable science development would be to turn that crank, towards violating expectations in terms of hypotheses. But that's going to create more failure. It's going to create more confusion, and it's going to create, a different kind of science, a science that's harder for any particular individual to read. It's going to create some chaos. So I think the question, it should be a broader societal question about what we want from our science. You know, do we want improved health next year, or do we want improved health in 50 years? So anyway, to the best.
Okay, I can jump in. Like bridging is a kind of combination. Not all combination are meaningful. So not actually all bridging is great. Like in music, you combine different tone, you get nice music. But some combination really all musicians try to avoid. Because in science, there's the bridging has like two kinds. One is clueless bridging, and one is a guided bridging. Like what James just said is more guided bridging, like like system biology. Like biology was like chemistry, the system chemistry or system biology. Before biology and chemistry was talk about individually, they look at cell compound as individual standalone entity, but didn't consider actually the cell is actually inside the organ, and the organ inside a human system. Why clinical trial failed or in the late stage? Because the preclinical look at standalone compound and protein they binding, but in the real system they didn't bind. So now all drug discovery start to learn from the failure. So this is a guide bridging, like learn from failure. Hey, we need to now when we do the preclinical drug discovery, we already should look at this as the cell is not cell itself. It's cell. It's in the pathway. It's a system in the organ in your human body. So they start with this and to reduce, but I tell you, the drug discovery industry is 3% success rate and $2 billion investment for 15 years effort. So you can say this, that's no matter what, it's great job. So bridging can be guided based on the science knowledge, the lessons we learned, and something we think, for instance, like AI and medical. Everybody know there will be bridge because there's so many checks X-ray image. We have only 200,000 radiologists in the country. We have billions image there. They read manually, like 2 minutes per minute, read 200 image per day, but how many they can do it. You can calculate the number of games. So they need AI. So there you can see a lot of bridging going on, like even company created. The radiologist, go to computer science, work with the professor. I think the AI will become the best bridge data-driven algorithm with the domain-specific problems in medicine, in life sciences, in electronic commerce, in industry, in chatbot, whatsoever, even. Yeah. So the other one is a clueless bridging, means like a sporadic discovery. There's many discovery it's random. It's like I try to find the example in my brain, but I couldn't find like this in this. I don't know whether you buy this air fried pan like from Costco, so you can put the chicken wing, but you don't need to put the oil, but the air fried is cool. Actually, this is electronic stove. They just build in a way that they bridge this idea with the commercial needs, because they couldn't sell this long time ago, and they have to be innovative to find idea to sell this. And someone designing this way to say it's intelligent and less oil, because everybody want to be healthy and don't want to and they can cook chicken way better than whatsoever. But basically, it's just electric stove. So those is kind of a bridging that it's very it's a sporadic. I don't think no matter through what kind of science, what kind of millions or billions data we find, we can actually systematically or statistically spot this because it's a random kind of thing. So that's why we have this conference. I encourage you to do all different conferences. You go to Science of Science, you go to totally psychology, you go to completely different philosophy, or you go to computer science. You meet people that you never will met if you don't go out, and then you collaborate with them, and suddenly you find a new field. Be adaptive. It's very important. Be adaptive. Be open-minded. Be adaptive to try to talk to those strangers you will see you never talk with. I think those kind of conference and trips, and I think even Zoom, like in COVID, I met people I will never meet in my life. Like suddenly, early stage of Zoom, there's all kinds of Zoom meetings talk about the misinformation. No, people from everywhere, Africa and everywhere, they just suddenly go to this place and talk about misinformation. It's so amazing. All these channels go to exploit. It's like exploit, find this connection and try this connection, and they will maybe generate some bridge that you never know. So that's mine.
So maybe the last question from Stephen. Oh, you're muted, Stephen.
Sorry, and yeah, so I think it's a great discussion, and I think this there's several questions in the chat that I think are related to this recent discussion about kind of innovation, bridging, diversification, and I think it's one of the real puzzles is there are a lot more diverse bridges than there are kind of local connections within a field. So it's this question of how do you identify the right bridge to make, right? And Ying had some great ideas, just let people do it. But I guess the other thing that I've heard about, and I was just curious if anyone has sort of results to report, is this idea of randomization. So let's just fund, we don't know which one to pick out of the n squared possible bridges. So let's just throw the dice and let randomness choose. And I was wondering, has that been successful? Is that as a way of kind of efficiently exploring this giant space?
So the Rory effort, I don't know if the Rory people are involved in this summer school, Research on Research Institute based out of the UK, London. Rory has been coordinating a lot of large scale RCTs with funders, especially European funders. So I think over the past 2 years, they've signed up a few, including ones from Switzerland and some funder. There's a broad correlation now that at least some funders are signing up now, but these are primarily small funders, right? The large funders like NIH, you're always going to be more conservative and look on the funds. But at least now there's a small number of funders are signing up and sort of agree to randomize around the margin. If that's the question of in thinking about the progress.
Well, a related finding comes from, I would say, Pierre Azoulay and colleagues' work on HHMI. So, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute funds individuals for longer periods of time on average, and so their grants are longer and they're not directed towards individual projects. They're driven just by the personal, history and claim about possible future projects, but it's not explicitly not accounted for. And two things you see, they do have some demonstration that so essentially people can build a risk portfolio, right, over the context of the work that they do over time. And so if something's a bad idea, they can pivot without any consequence, right? Whereas if you sought funding for a specific project, it's harder to pivot to use those funds to do something that you weren't granted to do. And they find that those research investigators are more likely to do surprising things. And I think there's two interpretations of that are confounded, but one is that they're pivoting to to different projects over time. But the second, which I think is probably more plausible, is that they're undertaking a wider range of risky projects, and it's with less predictivity, right? With less likely to predict which one's going to succeed. That allows one to succeed in a bigger way over so it's you have this ironic thing where, and I think this ties into Ying Ding's point, that if something's really unexpected, so has a very low probability of success, then if it succeeds, then it dramatically alters our cognitive understanding of the cognitive landscape of the innovative field. And I agree, it goes well beyond science here. So I think we, those kinds of findings to me suggest a real there. But I think there more needs to be done. It's just very difficult because, as Da-Shun says, the bigger the pot of money, the stronger the estimates, the more political exposure for specific targeting of failures as being a breach of fiscal responsibility.
So and also I feel like I have some new changed my own view as well, because when I started working with NIH, both James and I working with NIH, we've been advisors for their office directors for years. You know, I think my initial impression is, why don't you guys do RCTs? You know, like, why don't you guys do this and that? Like, what are you thinking? Like, are you, you know, a $40 billion budget, don't you need like 1% to figure out how well it works, you know? But now I actually realize that was very naive of me, because, you know, the money came out of taxpayer dollars, which go through all this kind of very complex political economy through Congress, Senate, starting from the president proposing budget. So I think, you know, so this is a lot more to manage, thinking about if something goes wrong, how do you manage the image, how do you sort of, maybe you will get cut actually completely if there's some mess up that is not well managed. So this is a lot more complex, I think. So I now actually sympathize a lot more that maybe they shouldn't do RCTs yet. Maybe that's not the right approach. So I actually now sympathize a lot more on that. And I think another point I want to sort of just add to this is there needs to be RCTs to think about whether whatever we funded works, and to think about what should we fund. But before that, before we optimize on what we fund, I think there's an overlooked point, is that we vastly underinvested in science. Okay, so a recent paper by Ben Jones and Larry Summers, who was a former Secretary of Treasury, just over the past year, they calculated what is the return of investment on science. And their estimate came back, the return on investment is roughly 5-fold. In other words, $1 we put in, we got $5 out of it. Okay, and there are other estimates too, is all ranging around this number. So then the question is, you know, if we have a machine that you can just put $1 and you get $5 in, we'll have like 1 million people every day just draw that machine. You know, we're just gonna use that all the time. But in science, we don't do that. So, you know, why is that? I think sort of that's kind of if anything, the pandemic also showed the power of science and the importance of science. You know, the whole Operation Warp Speed of developing vaccine, from the beginning, we know if we can develop vaccine 1 day shorter, it would easily pay for itself. If we open the economy 1 day earlier than we would otherwise, it easily, whatever we put in, easily pays itself. But yet we don't do that. I think, you know, another view I feel like I've been updating myself is not just thinking about how do we improve efficiency, not just thinking about how do we capture value, but also we need to create more value. You know, and if you think about all the calculation, like there is no sector in the economy where you have something that you put in $1, you get $5 out, and we don't keep putting in money until that saturates. And you know, I think science is the only sector that looks like that. So I think, you know, again, I feel like thinking about science of science, we should be very sort of realize we have to take a new approach in thinking about what the field is, what the field can do for science. And in my mind, is a lot more potential right now that we can actually try to change the way how we think about science and innovation.
I want to add in, actually, we as a community, we can contribute a little bit on this because we have a talent knowledge graph. We have large scale, we have all researchers from the whole world. We know what they do, we know their career, we know their, you know, how to speak, and we know many of the details. So basically, you know, for all this is a graph, it's more link prediction. Most kind of like even Google Scholar, everything like academic research driven, they are very passive. They recommend paper because you said you're interested based on what you think, because we are very tunnel vision. We only know things are close to us. And all these link prediction algorithm also has a tunnel vision because they predict the link you with the people like you. So if we can develop an algorithm we predicting the prediction based on how different you are, and also based on the domain knowledge of knowledge graph of biology, we think these two genes actually are in the pathway, might have some biological reason, and you two you're so different. Maybe we will recommend, hey, you guys might want to work together. So we actually, as a community, based on the tons of experience, we do all, this guy has an advanced career stage, and that guy just start, or this guy already in the peak of his career, or that, we have all these tools we develop, and James, your discovery and innovation and novelty, this indicator, we can actually recommend this randomness, creative groups, recommend they should work together.
And with that, I'd like to thank the panelists. I just want to warn the panelists that unfortunately, we only leave a couple of minutes of break before the mentoring session. So just, we have the mentoring like in 25 minutes. But I'd like to thank the mentors on behalf of everybody. I know that you cannot see everybody, but all the applauses from everybody. So thank you so much for being part of this. And yeah, so we'll take a break, and I'm gonna update the assignments, but probably there won't be reassignments today. Again, James unfortunately cannot.
Yeah, I'll
Yeah.
send you. Yeah, I'm gonna
Yeah.
send you my specific minutes, but I should be available for some of the time. So
Okay.
I'll send you that note.
Okay,
right
thank
now.
you so much.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Daniel and Stefan. Thank you, everyone, for organizing this wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you for sure. Bye.
Thanks for coming. It's been a great discussion this morning.
Yeah, for sure. Good to see you again, Stephen and Daniel.
Yep.
Yeah.